Well, it is now. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this slightly delayed session. My name is Nigel Meek. I am the editorial director of the Libertarian Alliance. Our next speaker is Sophie Robbins, and she'll be speaking about home education. She was herself home educated, and I know her talk will consist of a mixture of her personal experiences and how this applies to the home education movement more generally. I have I suppose, a little bit of personal interest in this subject. I was conventionally educated, so I left school at 16. Firstly, I spent most of the last 2 decades in the education sector in some format, whether as a mature student, an administrator, or at a very minor level, a teaching assistant, albeit all post-compulsory age. The second one is, which Sophie might regard as a bit of a challenge, I'm something of a home education skeptic. I'll put it no stronger than that. Assuming a normal family background, all children, of course, are home educated in the early years of their life. I'm sure I can continue for some time. I've never yet been convinced that home education can work at a later age, except for in the case of a remarkable, perhaps self-selecting minority. Perhaps Sophie might show I'm wrong, or maybe I just do not understand what home education means in the first place. Perhaps we should find out. Sophie.
Thank you. I haven't done anything yet. Okay, well, I was home educated almost my entire life. It was until the age of 16 when I voluntarily attended a sixth form college for 2 years. And I wouldn't have done a third one if I'd been paid. But I was raised not exactly according to libertarian principles. My father, to put it mildly, is a liberal. And in fact, by the age of 13, I already read The Social Contract and the Communist Manifesto. And I didn't have a clue who Karl Popper was. However, I think my experiences having been home educated put me in the best position possible to appreciate what the value of a movement like libertarianism, to appreciate the value of a system like capitalism, these sorts of things. I think that I'll start off by talking first about school briefly, because I think that there are 2 aspects of school that, I suppose rather like there are 2 aspects of capitalism, the moral aspect and the efficient aspect. You could say the same thing about about school. There is the practical application of schooling, which is to give some knowledge to some children, factual knowledge like history or trigonometry or whatever. And then there is a more moral dimension to school, which is the power that it seems to be given over things like a child's social life, their social skills, the way that they ought to interact with people, the way that they ought to live. School is fairly universally given authority in both of these aspects. And what I'd like to demonstrate is that it ought to have authority in neither. My parents taught me to read and to write and to do basic math and these sorts of things. I believe a lot of parents, even of children whom they intend to send to school, do this. They teach them the alphabet or addition or something like that. And there's an awful lot that you can learn in 5 years, which if you don't send a child to nursery school is the period of time they'll have before they're put into a primary school. I was generally offered knowledge in such a way that its inherent value would, or at least had the opportunity to make itself apparent to me. At the age of 5, I began violin lessons. It was a suggestion from my parents that I might want to learn music, and I tried it and I continued, and by the age of 11, I joined the Junior Guildhall and I was there for 5 years, and I only quit to make more room for sixth form college. I kept going with music lessons. I think this is a good example, entirely of my own accord. Everything that I did with them, every exam I took, was voluntary, and I enjoyed doing it. And I think it was because I could self-generate enthusiasm for music. And of course, school children or anybody self-generates enthusiasm for something that they do. That's how we do things well. But being in a home-educated environment really made it possible for me to take things seriously, to take a subject like music seriously, to take a subject a little later on like math seriously, that sort of thing. I think that I'll just say, just to give this the relevance and the importance that I wish to give it, I think that as a position opposing authoritarianism, the libertarian movement ought to have a great deal more, I wouldn't say sympathy, but interest in home education. Because I think it has room for considerably more confidence in its principles, libertarianism that is. It's strange how libertarian principles seem to fly out of the window whenever people talk about children. Well, I don't know if anybody else here attended the Convention on Modern Liberty in February, but there was a very interesting thing I heard there where somebody was proposing that that schools ought to focus on individual liberty more, that there was an exhibition on at the time on human rights, and they were suggesting that there ought to be school trips to this exhibition so that children could learn about liberty. And the point that I raised at the time was, well, you know, imagine the child in that class that didn't actually want to be there that day. How seriously could he take it being forced around this exhibition, telling him how free he was? And I think that there are an awful lot of contradictions of this kind whenever one tries to adopt libertarian principles but refuses to acknowledge the value of a home-educated system. So, well, I think probably the first point that really ought to be addressed is it's the fact that what home education makes possible is essentially a free market in knowledge. A child, instead of being told what they can learn at what times, at what speed, they can be offered knowledge from any source, from books, from the internet, from parents, whatever else, and they can choose to make of it what they will. But I think that if liberty works, we have little to no excuse to apply that principle to our children, just as we apply it to ourselves and to other adults. It's true that there are many practical reasons why a given child may attend school. I mean, our current way of life is not perfect. But I think that the point that I'd like to make is there's a problem with the moral assertion that children necessarily require authoritative guidance. By that I mean authoritative stricture, in order to live well or be good people. throughout the whole of my childhood, I never had any sense of being told what to do as such. I was offered advice on things that might be good to do. But broadly speaking, I think it was up to me whether or not to take it. So if I wished to read a book, I would read the book. In fact, I learned to read fairly early on, and I read a great deal as a child, but when I got to school, it surprised me how little of this had actually gone on in the early childhoods of other people, because, well, I suppose reading was a big thing for me. You know, I liked drawing, I liked music, and, you know, there were things that took my interest. What home education gave me was the opportunity to take these things seriously. If I wished to devote 5 hours at a stretch to reading a book or drawing a picture, I was entirely at liberty to do this. If I wished to seek advice on which books to read or what pictures might be good to draw, I could do this also. If I didn't wish to, it wouldn't be forced upon me. And I think that as a young child, no matter what other influences one is exposed to, being in that kind of atmosphere makes it far easier for somebody to understand the value of individual liberty, the value of you know, well, essentially what amounts to libertarian principles. But it's strange because also I distinctly recall when I was about 6 years old or so, well, it was essentially the labor theory of value being explained to me, although it hadn't been named as that. And you know, things like, you know, why should a person have a right to any given piece of property? You know, it's just land, it's just there, and then they just fence it off. But, you know, no, they don't have really any greater right to it than anybody else. I mean, you know, I was 5, 6 years old when I was being told these things. And I think that what's interesting about my situation is that when I was actually given persuasive arguments around age 14, I think, something like 14, 15, for a more libertarian way of life, a more pro-capitalism way of life, a more pro-individual way of life, I was more or less unhindered in seeing the value of this, despite the fact that for the past decade and a bit, the values that I'd been exposed to were almost entirely left-wing, getting further left. And I think that the reason for that, to the best of my judgment and with hindsight, is more or less entirely the fact that I was home educated, the fact that I had lived more or less according to those principles of individual liberty, no matter what it was that I had been being told during this time. School, I think, does almost the exact opposite. It was very surprising to me when I spent my 2 years in school. I served my sentence. Everything, even potentially good ideas, so when the occasions in the philosophy classes when they attempted to defend things like individual liberty, this happened once or twice, it was fairly rare. But even then it was couched entirely in authoritarian language and in an authoritarian way of doing things that, of course, we as the students were all living under. You know, when it was proposed that we ought to stand up for what we thought was right, the way of determining what was right that was offered to us, the students, by the school, was collectivist, authoritarian, based more in society than any kind of individual judgment. And it occurred to me while I was there what it would have been like to be in a place like that from the age of 5. No matter what values were being put forth, whether it was, you know, the liberalism and environmentalism that seemed to be very popular at the school that I was unfortunately at, or whether they had chosen to support something else. I didn't see how a 5-year-old, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old growing up in such an environment, attending every day, and with the implicit or explicit support of parents, in other words, no recourse to any other way of life, how they could possibly come out of it knowing how to defend good principles or how to defend themselves intellectually, morally. Because, well, while you can say an awful lot of things about how to do this, the fact is that in a school situation, and I feel that I can say this having experienced it myself, you simply don't live like that. You live according to different principles. You live according to collectivist principles. You live according to authoritarian principles. By contrast, my experience as a home-educated person was that even if I were being told collectivist things, you know, liberal things, communist things, the principles that I was living according to were more or less, I mean, I'm not saying that it was perfect, you know, a perfect example of this, but it was more or less the principles of making individual judgments, living mostly according to individual freedom. And when I say living mostly I didn't do this was the degree of failing on the part of the adults around me. I don't think that it's a necessity of a good home educating system. You know, people make errors in their reasoning, and you know, certainly I know, you know, the adults around me were not precisely perfect in this, but it was more or less the atmosphere that I grew up in was more or less one of individual freedom. I mean, there are a lot of questions that I commonly get asked about when I tell people that I'm home educated. You know, how did you structure each day? What time did you get up? You know, when did you do lessons? Things like this. So what I think I'll do is I'll briefly cover this. I went to sleep when I was tired. I got up when I was no longer tired and didn't wish to be in bed anymore. I ate when I was hungry, more or less. And I didn't start lessons. I would do things that seemed interesting when they seemed interesting to me. I mean, you know, of course, when I started things like violin lessons, they would be scheduled, but then I would be aware of this. I was attending them because I liked them. So I don't think that kind of private tutoring is comparable to the kind of lesson situation you get in schools. Most of the learning that I did actually took place in the form of conversations, and I still do this. You know, if something may come up, you know, one might hear something on the radio or the TV, one might read it in a book, and bring it up just in conversation with your parents or with your friends or whatnot. I note that I don't draw a distinction. I don't think there was any distinction, really. Certainly in terms of learning things, there was no distinction. And you would debate it, whether with a child one's own age, whatever the age that was, or with an adult. You would debate it and discuss it conversationally. And through this medium, the two of you putting forth your ideas and where you disagreed, discussing it, that was how I learned things. I mean, even, you know, when I say that I had things like the labor theory of value explained to me, well, that was still in the form of a conversation. I wasn't sat down with a PowerPoint presentation and informed that this was how things was. It was mentioned in passing as part of a conversation. I just happened to remember it. Because, well, my father got quite enthusiastic about it. It was quite memorable. So this whole business of when did I start lessons, you know, what subjects did I do? Well, I don't know what subjects I did. I don't know what lessons I did. I talked about things that seemed interesting. And now it's, in my household, there are an awful lot of books. My father teaches architecture. Those of you who've read The Fountainhead enjoy the joke. He teaches architecture, and he likes art. He likes art history. He likes history not related to art also. So, you know, in the house there was, you know, the Encyclopedia Britannica. If there was something I was curious about, I could look it up in that. You know, there are a lot of books on a lot of subjects lying around, just in general. So I had, you know, quite a considerable opportunity, I suppose, to encounter interesting things. But I think that sort of thing, and I raise it because this is something often brought up by people who are at least skeptical, if not opposed to home education, is, you know, but you had, you know, this opportunity, there were so many books everywhere. You know, in other situations, you know, children don't have lots of books, and you know, it's too far to walk to the library, or, you know, something like that, or they're not encouraged to read books. While there was a lot of that kind of material lying around the house, I don't think that really played the major role in the interesting things that I encountered. They were usually more used either for entertainment or for reference. Probably the most valuable skill that I picked up in terms of acquiring knowledge was the ability to talk freely to adults. I think, you know, my parents, well, not only did my parents treat me more or less as a human being rather than as a kind of potential human being to be guided for the next 18 years until I achieved human being status, but they also expected other adults to do the same. So my father, you know, if he went out to dinner with friends of his, as often as not, I would go with them. Yeah, you know, of course I would be up until 10, 11 at night with them. I wouldn't be tired. It wouldn't be a problem. And I would be entirely at liberty to listen to the conversation and to join in with the conversation. In fact, fairly often I was encouraged to join in with the conversation. I remember my father made a very big point about not excluding me from adult things. And, you know, he said this to me at the time in those words when I was young. So I generally went through life with the expectation that if there was a conversation or a book or you know, a TV show or something with information in it that interested me, I wouldn't be barred from joining in with it, exploring it, asking questions about it, for as long as it managed to hold my interest. And so ironically, even though my father is not the greatest fan of the free market, what he essentially created was, as I said, a free market in information. If the knowledge could make itself seem valuable to me, I would value it for as long as it could continue to make itself seem valuable. Which was why I kept up with the music for so long, because it seemed very valuable to me. I wasn't forced into doing it, and when I did feel as though I was forced into doing it, which was in the last couple of years at the Guildhall, it became progressively more schooly as I was there. And I quit that year. I decided I didn't want to learn anymore in that environment, therefore I quit. With hindsight, I feel that I probably should have taken this as a warning not to go to sixth form college. But I was too optimistic and not critical enough really of a system that admittedly I didn't really have any knowledge of. So from the age of about 6 until the age of about 11, I was mostly interested in music. At age 11, I became very interested in mathematics. I had a new math tutor, and they were very passionate about the math. So when I would go there, again, because I would have private tutors for these things, the lessons would still take the form of a conversation, because it's quite difficult for one person to deliver a lecture to another person when you're both sat next to each other at a table and there's nobody else in the room. It doesn't really last. It turns into a conversation. So I spent several years going to this person's house, and we do it for a couple of hours every few days. And I would go there, and we would have coffee, and we would have cookies, and we would have the textbook. And we never took any formal notes. This only seems strange in hindsight, but at the time it seemed perfectly ordinary that I would never write down ordered notes about things. We would just use scratch paper to, do arithmetic we didn't want to do in our heads, or to draw a diagram or whatever. So I would just chuck these pieces of paper away afterwards, if I remembered everything that was on. So this was the environment in which I was learning math for 4 years or something like that. I volunteered to take the math GCSE privately, just to apply as an individual candidate through a centre. Yes, it is legal to do this. And so we got the textbook for the GCSE syllabus, and we went through it in exactly the same way. We were covering about a chapter of the textbook every week, and if it was a long chapter, it might take a week and a half. When I took the exam, I found it pretty easy, and I got an A in it as my final grade. And when I think a big part of this was that I was able to maintain enthusiasm for GCSE level math, because my tutor was always willing to explain to me concepts that were not dealt with at GCSE. So before I took the GCSE, I had already learned about calculus, and I had already learned about imaginary numbers and things like these things that are on the A-level syllabus. And my tutor would be quite willing to derail a class on the GCSE syllabus in order to talk about something else that wasn't on the syllabus but that was more interesting. And we were still getting through a chapter a week doing this. So when I went to school, I was very interested in doing math, and it was one of my main subjects. And at the end of the 2 years, I actually ended up failing this class because I stopped attending the classes, essentially. And when I was there, I wasn't paying any attention. Because I couldn't really... It was impossible for me to maintain any enthusiasm in a subject presented not as an interesting thing with explanatory power to be discussed, but as a series of rules and skills to be memorized in order to pass an exam, which is precisely how math is presented in schools. And I think the reason I want to go into so much depth with the math is because, as far as I can gather, math classes are a stereotype for being the unpleasant class in schools, unless you're a nerd. But it's, hard sums are a kind of unpleasant punishment given to school children that, that they resent and wish that they didn't have to do. And I really didn't understand this until I went to school, because it seemed like something very interesting, because it explained things about reality. It was...
questions.
Okay. So I think that this point is generally applicable to learning in general in both situations, and not just school subjects, but I suppose a school teacher might call it life skills, but I really hate that term. I guess philosophy, epistemology, ethics, things like that. Things in a home-educated atmosphere are presented as either having inherent value that can be demonstrated or not, and then you don't bother with them. So I think that to a libertarian crowd, this really ought to be, in my opinion, something very valuable, because it's the opportunity to put into practice libertarian principles from a very early age, and to apply them and actually take them seriously and live by them. Certainly from my experience, I think that it's entirely borne that out, which is why I think I found it so easy to make the transition from communism to some kind of objectivism, libertarianism that I have right now.
Thank you. Question.
Thank you very much. Sophie, I think that you've given a very good presentation of home education, I think typical home education and so on. And you said that it was a libertarian sort of education.
Sorry, could you use the microphone, please?
Yeah. I totally disagree that home education introduced someone to a libertarian society. I think a libertarian society is a society that replaces politics with exchange. In other words, that in a capitalist world, you sell something or you give something and you expect something back. What we have demonstrated is that you were receiving everything. I was offered this, I was offered that. I was told that I could wake up whenever I wanted and I could eat whenever I wanted. What is it that you gave back? What is it that you were taught that in order to live this sort of life, I need to give something back? That is what capitalism is about. And that is precisely the sort of education that doesn't lead you to a capitalist lifestyle. In the real world, when you are dealing with clients, you have to be of service to the client. You have to listen to the needs of the client, and then give the client exactly what the client wants. I don't think this education that you have described is anyway an introduction to the real world. Now that you are grown up, welcome to the real world.
May I respond, or shall I?
Yes.
Firstly, I was not told that I could wake up when I wished or eat when I wished. I just did it. It wasn't a permission that was granted me. Secondly, I'm surprised what you seem to be describing when you say that a client comes to you and tells you their needs and you do exactly what they want. In order to do this, but I think both of you have to be, especially the client, has to be able to freely make value judgments themselves. I think that what you've described is like a kind of very specific aspect of commerce that kind of takes place when you're signing a contract. I don't really think that that's all there is to living in a free society. Secondly, what I gave back was an interesting conversation. When I was, well, unless it was a private tutor, in which case I gave money. But
your parents did.
Yes.
Well, of course, my parents had a moral obligation to do that, especially since even if I could have been valuable certainly, or I wouldn't have been allowed. But in any case, the real valuable stuff that I learned, what I was giving back was an interesting talk. If I asked an interesting question, we would have a good conversation about it. If you and I have a conversation, you don't come to me and say, this is the conversation that I would like to have. This is how we will do it. Here, please sign this contract. Now let's have this conversation specifically about this. It's a fluid thing. It doesn't behave precisely according to the model that you've just given, but it is valuable to both of us. Nobody is actually losing out. I think that is certainly a description of what it was like to learn in the manner that I did. And I think that it's still a part of an open society, even though it doesn't conform precisely to this client capitalist relationship that you just described.
Brian Micklethwaite and then Ben.
I just want to say how completely I disagree with what Christian Michel has just said. I think it was just vile, actually. and I also think it embodied the fallacy of consumer sovereignty. It is not the case that you have to do exactly what your clients want. Typically in trade, they also have to do what you want. They have to turn up at the time that you want them to in order to hear what you've got to offer them. The fact is that sovereignty cuts both ways in a relationship like that. And as the speaker has subsequently explained in some detail, you can't just have any old conversation you like with people if they don't want to have it with you. I think that the experience that the speaker described was fundamental to the free society, and it is the experience of making decisions yourself, as opposed to having them made for you all the time, relentlessly, by school teachers, and then experiencing for yourself the consequences of those decisions. By no means all of those consequences, I dare say, being good ones. Often discovering, well, I don't want to do it like that again, or I don't want to waste my afternoon that way, or read that particular author, or whatever. No, I completely disagree with Christian. I think your central proposition that the experience of liberty is a wonderful preparation for being somebody who believes in liberty in a much more formal and abstract and theoretical manner was entirely convincing.
Thank you. That was definitely the case when I read Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Ben, briefly.
I won't carry on beating up poor old Christian Michel in the unnecessary defence of what I may call Sophie's world. I think he mistook who the client was. In 1809, the most famous, I think, home-educated person, John Stuart Mill, had to learn Greek without a Greek-English lexicon, and he had to rely on his father, who was at the time writing his history of British India. Now we have the internet, and surely every parent who wants to toy, even for 10 minutes, with home education, can avail themselves of that resource. Turning to schools, I think libertarians should entertain strongly the idea that vouchers for education be made available not to parents but to children, and I simply ask you broadly, what do you think the earliest age at which children should be offered such vouchers?
Going from my own experience, I would say age 3, but I only say that because I can't really remember anything before that age. I think as early as they can talk, as early as they are capable of having conversations with people.
So we are, get back on track, time for perhaps just 2 more very, very quick questions and responses, please, and...
Could I ask very briefly, what do you think the effect would have been had you not had an interest in mathematics or reading? Would you have grown up then to be illiterate or not have the knowledge of arithmetic or calculus?
I think that the only way that I could have turned out illiterate would be if I had never been allowed in a bookshop, library, or any shop that sold any magazines, ever. I think that even if there had not been books in the house, I would have walked into W.H. Smith's and been curious about what all of these square-looking, colourful things were. And I would have asked, and the answer would duly have been given. And I think that the reason that I would, in that instance, have wished to learn to read in any case, it isn't because I was kind of prompted that way and sort of continued believing that it was valuable to read. I think it's because reading, or arithmetic or whatnot, is inherently and objectively valuable. You know, if I found that I kept getting ripped off whenever I bought something because I was being overcharged and I couldn't calculate the change, I would probably want to learn arithmetic pretty quickly. I might wish to learn it just because it's interesting. You know, I think that there are an awful lot of situations in real life where these things make themselves, they make it obvious themselves that they're valuable by being a good thing to have in a situation. And I think that this objective value makes itself very, very obviously known to any and every child.
David.
I am a home educator.
Very good.
I have been, oh, thank you very much. I've been home educating a young man, not my son, who's just turned 16, and I just wanted to say how your remarks about maths in particular resonated with his experience of having to conform to what is effectively a government syllabus, which is not very interesting, I agree with you. He's just got A's in maths, science and English. I just wanted to ask you briefly, do you see any connection between the encouragement of individual critical thinking by people like yourself and this young man I'm talking about, and the government's beginning the preparation of a campaign ultimately to assault the freedom to home educate in this country?
Sorry, oh, that, yes. Well, given the choice, I would raise my children in America. I think that if the government wishes to impose this campaign and they succeed, the people who wish to home educate will probably just leave. And what they'll be left with is a country full of less and less individually critical people. So they're stabbing themselves in the foot. If they actually succeed in doing this, and people don't complain and the situation doesn't get reversed, they'll just mess up the country a little more.
Sophie, thank you very much indeed. I think for those of us who are, as I say, conventionally educated, at least up to a point, it's a fascinating window on a world which few of us can really not really understand. We just haven't been through it. Sophie, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.